Hello and welcome to another level design learning video. In this video, I will be examining the space I built for a level design test sent to me by Irrational Games to work on BioShock Infinite. The test was structured as what they call a design challenge. And the criteria for the design challenge was described this way. Build us a cool vertical space that incorporates what you feel should be the elements of BioShock Infinite's verticality. While I realize you don't necessarily know all the ins and outs of how our skylines work, I'd love to see how you'd use these to facilitate vertical travel and interesting spaces. Obviously, you can use whatever sort of stand-in mesh or BSP you need to communicate where the skylines are on the map. In short, show us what you think could make interesting infinite gameplay. And no, the skylines don't actually need to function. After many years of taking level design tests, some successful, some less than successful, I learned quite a few things about the criteria and methods used by game studios to evaluate potential candidates. So here are some good ideas to keep in mind. Game studios typically are looking for a candidate who has already worked on their game. That is their ideal candidate. So you have to think along those lines when applying for jobs. What that means is you want to be familiar with not only the genres of their games, but their published games as well. In the case of Irrational Games, this would provide me some insights into their game design notions and sensibilities, their game mechanics, their level design spaces, and the narrative elements found in their game and in their level design spaces. When I had applied to Irrational Games, I was fortunate enough that they had recently released an E3 demo of the in-progress BioShock Infinite. This provided me with some insights into how to address some of the requirements of the test. This would include verticality, interesting spaces, skyline traversal, and what they would call infinite-style combat. Now let's take a look at the level I created for the test to see how I applied this analysis to the playable spaces. After thoroughly examining the E3 demo, I decided to build a more conservatively scaled project for the amount of time that I had, something that would focus a little more on the justification of skylines as freight transport, and a little less on extremely dramatic moments such as this, with extreme dramatic effect by extreme declines that seem a little bit divorced to me from their use as a freight transport. I'd also focus a little bit on the skylines being constructed in parallel tracks, with the freight running in predetermined directions. And I'll think a little bit in my space about the distance between individual skylines, the distance between skylines and landing areas, and also steep sloping when necessary, like here, to gain momentum on descent. With these considerations in mind, I decided to build my map in Call of Duty 4 Radiant, where I could address the presentation needs that I typically like in my own levels, including the possible use of patch meshes for the skylines and BSP to construct the buildings that I needed. Here we are in the Call of Duty 4 Radiant map. I kept the texture choices pretty simple, just bricks and cement mostly. I didn't use any grid textures on this. I wanted to sort of try to convey a real space a little bit. I put red arrows in the world to indicate the directions that the freight would move on the skylines. Here we have just indications of airships that would have been patrolling the city. In the distance, we can see some skylines that kind of go off into nowhere. That was supposed to indicate that there would be more spaces outside of this initial district here. There's a lot of verticality. There's this sort of overarching tower that is above the whole space. And then there's a lot of staircases here to descend into some of the lower levels. I tried to indicate that there was a clear evidence of structural supports, like these posts that I'm running between right now. Because I felt like in the demo that I watched, I thought that it was a little concerning that the skyline seemed to go off over vast distances with no real structural support. I was trying to make kind of a sandbox space here with a lot more density of skylines and areas like here where you could jump from ledges onto skylines that were nearby. I wanted to make it kind of clear where there were sort of entry and exit points from walking or riding the skylines. I also tried to think about when the skylines could run close together, like some of these tracks that run under this infrastructure, they pass close together. And I put these cards of enemies, pictures of enemies on the wall there to show like combat opportunities as the player moved past open buildings. And there's a lot of sort of nooks, I guess you could say, where player can during normal gameplay they have opportunities maybe to find cover if there's combat or just not to be seen. The space overall has been more constrained for sure. There are some areas here that are sort of undefined. I sort of left it up to the imagination as to what they could be. This is the bottom level of this district of the city. That's how I envisioned it anyway. I didn't really go into a lot of detail describing what the justification was of each of these buildings. It's more like I was trying to find a space that was scaled to what I thought were good mechanics for combat in the game, because the demo that I watched was mainly combat. Here, up above this space here, this is originally I had pictured this as maybe like a hotel or a civic building that kind of towered over the space below. But I put skylines that ran through these buildings because I thought, again, because it was a freight system, I pictured the tracks running near buildings where freight could be loaded or unloaded. Here we have just some sort of verandas and balconies. I saw a number of these in the demo. I thought they would be interesting spaces to sort of get a view, like here, of all the traversal options on the skylines where you could look across the space. And again, right here, this balcony is pretty much there to look out into the vista and also to have really clear access to the skyline as well. Also, yeah, there's a lot of different rooftop heights. Like I said, there's one up here, one below, and I felt like that would give you opportunities to counter opponents that were maybe below you, or it might provide you a challenge if enemies attack you from some of the upper areas as well. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to go into debug no-clip mode and sort of fly around in the intended direction of where you would be when you ride the skylines. This isn't something I included instructions on when I submitted the map for the test. I feel like that was a bit of an oversight on my part. Otherwise, if you don't include the details to give the players the experience that you want, even in this early proto phase, you leave your map open to misinterpretation. And I feel like that's what happened with some of my initial feedback on the map. After submitting the map, I received some critique from Irrational Games, including the space felt very multiplayer. It felt like a lot of the space was there simply for gameplay, and a very deathmatch style gameplay. There was a lack of believability. It would have trouble fitting into a BioShock world. There was difficulty seeing what most of the space was meant to do. From a high level, it was understood that it was a factory of some sort. It wasn't really clear what many of the nooks were for. And it was uncertain why the skyline path took all the twists and turns that it did. After sending me this feedback, they invited me to resubmit the map with some revisions to address their concerns. After carefully considering their critique, I decided to come up with a revision plan to address 4 key factors that I felt would help the level overcome its problems of misconception. My first objective in this revision would be to give believable justification, both structurally and narratively, for all areas of the space. This was a concept the studio referred to internally as a hierarchy of purpose. Secondly, I would explain and clarify how the skylines on the map would facilitate vertical travel and what they call interesting spaces and why those spaces were interesting. I would show what I thought could make interesting Infinite-style gameplay. I would also explain proposed gameplay scenarios and describe possible scenarios involving the level geometry. As part of the final revision, I created a new detailed map guide grounded in micro and macro narrative with a hierarchy of purpose made up of different districts with more distinct individual themes. I added in-world annotations, seen here as red letters, to mark areas shown in screenshots that were to be described in greater detail. I began the revision document with a statement of purpose for the level. This borough of the city is a dramatic illustration of the social divide between the netizens of Colombia. It is inspired by the themes of Fritz Lang's immortal Metropolis, where the wealthy and powerful live in splendor in the heights of the city, while their world is fueled by the toil of the workers in the shadows below. This final iteration is still a blockout, but this time I went back and used a greater variety of textures and props as visual touchstones to the world of BioShock Infinite that also placed a greater justification in the environmental narrative of the space. So in this revised version of the map, I spent a lot of time including annotations. In the level, seen here as the floating red letters made in BSP, to designate certain areas that were worthy of greater description. And I referenced these letters in the accompanying Word doc with sort of a narrative justification for all the spaces that were marked, including my attempts to reinforce this idea of the social divide in the city and the hierarchy of purpose that generated the reasons for this particular construction in this particular district in the city. Seen over, towering over the entire area, the entire district, is this blue building. Formerly, a lot of this whole area was misperceived as a factory, and that was due in part to my lack of descriptions, due in part to my lack of detail, probably due in part to my thorough use of the brick texture to cover most of the structures in here. I used kind of a bluish texture on the building. I included a lot of indications of windows in the structure to make it look more like a hotel would look. And I marked it with the letter J and described it as the Borman Hotel and Casino. This massive blue building was financed and constructed by J.R. Borman, who vanished after the hotel was built. The guests of this establishment would often arrive by airship at B and then proceed across the walkway stretching from A to J and enter through the main entrance. Next, I added a K letter here to describe the reasons why the skylines went through the center of this building. Again, to try to dispel that misconception of this as a factory. Here I described it as the Hotel Private Freight. The upper part of the hotel has its own private docks to receive incoming freight, often rare or luxury goods. The elite of the elite often stayed in the penthouses of the upper floors, and all their desires were met by the freight arriving here. Rumor has it that the owner of the hotel, J.R. Borman, has lived in near total seclusion on the top floor of the hotel since the beginning of Colombia. Over to the side here, there was a separate building. This was kind of an unclear structure, just kind of providing a structural end to the side of the map, really. This time I added a little more detail about this building's origins and labeled it H, and also included more window type structures in the side of it to indicate that it was indeed a building, a separate building. I described this building as the financier's office. This building is filled with business professionals who spend their days arranging the financing of all the latest ventures in Colombia. Many of their clients are the wealthy guests at the Borman Hotel, who often stop in here to check on their investment. Also, on the top levels of this map are some other areas with a little more detail. These were sort of, these areas here on the side were things that could be considered nooks, as they were referred to in the critique. So I decided to add a little more prop detail to justify their existence. If this was sort of a veranda on the edge of the hotel, you could see things like lampposts and human scale benches, things like that. And I described this simply as hotel patio. This veranda was added on the exterior of the Hotel Borman as a place to host outdoor parties. And here we have this labeled P. Even other areas of the map that had skylines in them, I wanted to try to explain in a little more detail why they were there, what was their purpose. This I just called the rear Borman skyline. So if you follow it, and again, a drawback on my part because I have to free fly around the map to show this off, but this just shows that the skyline actually has a contiguous path around this big structure here that goes around one side of the building and then goes through an opening in the building here to continue on, and then all the skylines marked with O at the end just represent other districts. The skylines that stretch beyond this district to areas that weren't represented in this map, just to show that there was a bit of thought on my part to areas that were outside the playable space, indicating to the player that Columbia was a bigger area than they were actually able to navigate as a player. If we go down to sort of the mid-tier here, or maybe even still the upper tier really, we have this area marked here at A. This became a pretty important structure in the scope of the whole map. This time I added more detail to it, including some antenna to kind of show off its importance. It's sort of a focal point in the center of the map where the skylines all converge. And I described this area as the air traffic control tower. Much of the central structure of the map is built to support a path for the residents of the city to board the dirigible airships that dock at this station. Traffic controllers keep track of passing ships, and this tower acts as a sort of lighthouse beacon that maintains order of passing sky traffic. A walkway extends across the street below, seen here, allowing disembarking passengers to make their way to the Borman Hotel, a large blue building that dominates the surrounding area. So that was kind of the main purpose, and gave a little bit of a justification for this upper level. The idea behind the upper level being that that's where the air traffic controllers actually worked and sent radio signals to the airships and the rest of the traffic in Columbia. If we navigate over here to the side area, I describe this as a docking platform. The station here is equipped with a large swiveling docking gantry that extends out into space. This is my attempt to provide some justification for this round shape at the edge of the map. This gantry can be tethered to docked airships to move people and freight. So in other words, when the player is up here and they walk down this way, you could imagine maybe a control lever here on this this podium that swings that out into space, and they could either board an airship or disembark from an airship, or the cargo right here on the skylines could be loaded or unloaded from the airship. If we look around a little more, this was one of the nooks that I think was referenced in the critique. I labeled it as C, and I described this as fuel delivery. It can be seen from this perspective here or from the street below there. But I described this as kind of a useful space. The steps that lead down to C here end at a platform adjacent to cargo containers on the skyline. When coal containers are stopped at the platform, workers can unload the coal from them to fuel the engine that powers the docking gantry at B. Stowaways have been known to use these containers to sneak on or off airships. By linking a bit of a narrative to this space and a gameplay possibility, I created a justification for the nook. If we look around a little more, if we go to the other side of this sort of central structure, again, this is kind of describing the infrastructure of why this is here. We have this area marked by L. Now, originally, when I was concentrating on gameplay, my thoughts were that this was an easy way to get on or off a skyline, maybe even secretly, and not be noticed. And so in this part, I described it as another part of the freight system. In this case, this is kind of like a loading dock. This was street cargo delivery. The platform here was used in much the same way as that at C. With the cargo cars stopped, workers could unload them and carry goods for sale or transport to mechanized horse carts parked on the street near the park at M. So my idea here was that things would be unloaded from the skyline. Workers would take the goods down here, down the stairs, and down to the street, where I was alluding to these sort of automata-driven horse carts that were shown in some of the demos and advertisements for the early versions of the game. So from here, we can progress down to sort of the lower levels of the city, and here's where the other half of that idea of a social divide came from that I tried to reinforce in my conception for the level. Here was a park. The idea here was maybe the park was donated by the hotel man. This is the Miranda Borman Park, named after the hotel man's deceased daughter, who fell from Columbia out of the sky at this very spot. So that was the sort of justification for this. If we look down the street here, this idea here was sort of inspired by inner cities where there's sort of poor, cheap apartments by noisy elevated train tracks. That was kind of the idea here. The freight would rumble by these apartments, shown here at N. I called these the bottom garden apartments. The foundation of the Borman Hotel also serves as smaller apartments for the servants working at the hotel and other street-level businesses. Usually the day's washing can be seen hanging out on the balcony railings. These apartments were planned rather poorly, clattering freight cars on the skyline awful rumble noisily by the tenants' windows. A modest street-level entrance, shown at R, is located near the hotel overpass. Here. So originally my idea for this area was, I did think that this was an inhabitable area, but I had this idea that there were small balconies there where enemies shown by the cards on top of them could be attacking you as you rode the skyline along this area. You could have kind of a shooting gallery experience or hop off the skyline to move inside the building and then back on the skyline again. I was trying to give the player a lot more areas for gameplay to hop on or off skylines, and that was kind of the idea here. But here I sort of showed that there was a purpose behind this. And also on the street level here, I tried to add sort of evidence. This was an actual working street with traffic directions in both ways. We have in this way, like the horse carts could go one direction that way, and they could go up the hill in this direction that way. And at the end of the street here, I actually include some proxy meshes showing like the horse carts that this is actually a street. And at Q here, I describe this just so this seems like it's part of the infrastructure. As I said before, this is the hotel overpass over the street. This tall structure provides a grand approach for hotel guests above, but its importance at the street level is to support the many skylines that run beneath its arches. So again, the skylines aren't free-floating in space. They're actually supposed to be tethered or supported by that overpass. So the street runs from one end of the district to the other, but the workers at this level rarely mix with the elite who frequent the hotel above. The environment here is similar to a modern-day inner city, where old apartment buildings were later sandwiched between noisy elevated train tracks. So that's that idea again. Right here we have this building before wasn't really defined as a building. It seemed mostly like large slabs, just making there be no reason for this rooftop area. But now the idea here was that this is now a constabulary, where security officers for the district use this building as their barracks. The roof supports the airship docking platform above. So this end of the street I pictured as being quite a possible reason for criticism as far as unexplained nooks and dead ends. Right here, this was originally nothing. This time I decided to make it look more like an actual gate area. I marked it with D, and I described this as the blacksmith. So the gates here are the entrance to the blacksmith shop. This shop often repairs the mechanized horse carts that carry freight unloaded from the airships that dock in the district. And again, giving purpose to this nook. At the dead end of this street here, I included some closed gates. I'm just calling these district gates here. This is where the street traffic enters this part of the city, and the gates control traffic between this district and maybe another district that wasn't actually part of the map beyond. Again, sort of alluding to the fact that this playable fantasy here, this fictitious world, is bigger than what you can actually traverse as a player. Here at F, I kind of reinforce this economic system here, this idea that almost this lower district for the poorer denizens of Colombia, it's almost like what they used to call a company town at the turn of the century. And here the idea is there's a general store here at F, likely owned by the same man who owns the hotel, where all the imported goods and services arriving from airships at the local dock are sold to the commoners living and working at this street level. So that's sort of my idea for how everything here can have a hierarchy of purpose. It can have a justification beyond seeming like just simple gameplay. I think at this point, at least my ideas were much more understood, and I feel like as a level designer, that's one of your chief concerns, is your communication of your ideas. In some ways, this interview process is a bit of a cautionary tale about not communicating the ideas of your level design with enough clarity or precision. Since my level consisted purely of a playable map with no scripting, no actual gameplay. The clarity of communication lay strictly in the details of the level geometry. A word of advice to my past self would have been, pursue make-believe. This sounds elementary, it sounds very simple and understandable, but it's something that you have to do. You have to consider yourself as a level designer, as the author of your own fantasy, and as the evangelist of your own fantasy. And as that evangelist, you want to engage other people to get as excited about your ideas as you are. And in this particular instance, I felt in the first iteration, I had failed to do that. When I first received the critique on this level, I thought that the criteria for the level given to me was a bit at odds with the critique I later received. But in hindsight, that's largely irrelevant. It's a common tactic in tests to keep candidates on their toes, to give them the chance to flex their creative muscles, to show their ability to iterate and adapt to creative changes, because this really mimics the common realities of game development. I hope this video helped you gain some insight into the creative process used for taking a level design test, and for some of the criteria and the insights that the studios want from you about your creative process.